Hello there, students. Thank you for being part of this presentation today. My name is Luis Silva. I am your social studies teacher, and today we are going to focus on U.S. imperialism, empire, and expansion from 1890 all the way to 1909. But what is imperialism? Imperialism is basically building an empire by dominating other nations. First, politically, second, militarily, and thirdly, economically. Some important ideas that we need to talk about is that since the 1790s, U.S. territorial expansion has largely focused on Western expansion. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner said that the frontier was basically closed, meaning the U.S. had expanded from the original 13 colonies on the east coast of North America all the way to the west coast of North America and the Pacific Ocean. The 1890s marked a transition in U.S. history. The United States became a global power. Motives for imperialism. There are various motives. The first one is economic motives. The second is political motives. The third one is strategic as well as military motives. And lastly, ideological motives. In terms of economic motives, the U.S. wanted to open up markets abroad. It wanted access to cheap raw materials. Political motives, the U.S. had a desire to compete with other nations. It did not want to fall behind from European nations who had been basically imperializing many areas around the world, including Africa. In terms of strategic as well as military motives, the U.S. wanted to have or acquire military bases in different parts of the world. Alfred T. Mayhem wrote in The Influence of Sea Power the need to have a powerful navy in order to control different parts of the world. This obviously involved also the building of the Panama Canal. And ideological motives, basically the idea of the white man's burden. Darwin's concepts apply to international affairs now. Reverend Josiah Strong in our country basically said that Anglo-Saxon civilization is superior and must colonize other lands to spread superior civilization. So the idea is that the United States, a white man's country, basically had the right to go to other nations and basically take over them and civilize them. This obviously is a very bad motive, and nowadays we see this as very racist, as you're basically demeaning other people, calling them uncivilized, calling them inferior to your own, in this case, his own personal view. One of the first case study, Hawaii, when it comes to imperialism, is that in the 1820s, American missionaries went to the island of Hawaii to convert native people to Christianity. American sugar and pineapple planters began buying up land. And one of those groups of people that went to Hawaii was the Dole family, which became very influential in everything that happened in Hawaii. In 1887, the United States signed a treaty which basically established Pearl Harbor as a naval base. Various interests in the U.S. want to annex Hawaii. Queen Lolowokani advocated that Hawaii should be controlled by the Hawaiian people because it's their land, it's their territory. Now, revolts orchestrated by plantation owners, white men, plantation owners, basically overthrew the Queen in 1893, and Grover Cleveland rejected basically annexing Hawaii, but later on William McKinley decided that he was going to annex Hawaii. This happened in 1898. Now moving to Cuba. Cuba was one of the few colonies that basically was controlled by Spain. Revolts against Spanish rule were becoming very common in Cuba. Now, the Spanish general created a big conflict by acting in a very bad way. So the Spanish general basically took controversial steps to stop some of the rebellions that were taking place in Cuba. And he basically put people in concentration camps. Many Cubans died of starvation and diseases, and people were unhappy in Cuba. But why does the US care about this? Well, US has a big investment in sugar plantations in Cuba. This obviously created a problem because the United States had to protect, the investments of its people in Cuba. Sympathy for the plight of the Cuban people was exaggerated by yellow journalism, which basically it's a type of reporting in which you exaggerate everything that's happening in a particular area, in this case in Cuba. And therefore, many Americans felt a lot of sympathy for the Cubans because according to this report, the Cuban people were being like butchered. The Cuban people were being mistreated in such an inhumane way. Now, this actually got worse by the Delom letter, which was a Spanish official who, in a letter, disrespected President McKinley and basically angered more Americans. The main explosion, February 15th, 1898, was basically the last thing that was done here in Cuba. And the worst thing is that Spain was actually blamed for this explosion in which many American military personnel died. Later on, we find out that Spain had nothing to do, basically. Before we move on, I do want to say that Spanish was, in this case Spain, the Spanish were no match for the United States. Literally, Spain was just a shadow of its old glory. Spain was no longer a power. It was barely hanging on to some territories by this time. But the yellow press basically blamed Spain for the destruction of the battleship Maine. In April 1898, the United States declared war against Spain. US, Cuba, Philippines versus Spain. Now, the US decided to pass an amendment. It wasn't technically an amendment, but it's known as the Teller Amendment, in which the US said that it had no intention of taking over Cuba. Cuba will control their own government, which later on the US decided to change its mind. The Spanish-American War was called a splendid little war. It was actually not a war. I mean, Spain could not compete with the United States. The United States was becoming this global power, strong navy, and it was literally no match for the U.S. But Secretary of State John Hay referred to the war as a splendid little war. George Dewey crushes basically the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Theodore Roosevelt led a volunteer regiment called the Rough Riders, and the war ends in August 1898 with the Treaty of Paris. But the Treaty of Paris managed to create basically a debate in the United States. The Treaty of Paris allowed the United States to acquire Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. What was the impact of the war? Well, there was a key debate. People were having debates about what was going to happen with all of this new territory. And, it wasn't easy because some people in the government felt that, yeah, we should be annexing those territories. Other people said, no, we should not be annexing those territories. And the debate in Congress, obviously, you need a 2/3 majority required to ratify a treaty. The Anti-Imperialistic League opposed annexation of the Philippines. Rightfully so, the Philippines were on the other side, or was on the other side of the world. Why do we need, to have control of a nation on the other side of the world? Members obviously included Carnegie, AFL leader Samuel Gompers, and others who basically did not feel too comfortable in annexing or controlling, especially in this case, the Philippines. But McKinley favored expansion, and Congress narrowly approves the treaty. Now, Cuba. United States technically leaves Cuba in 1902. Remember, we talked about the Teller Amendment before? Now, there was another basically piece of legislation passed, which is known as the Platt Amendment, passed in 1901. The U.S. basically can intervene to restore peace and order. Remember, the Teller Amendment basically said the U.S. was not going to do anything. The Cubans could deal with their own problems. But now the US like, no, that's not the case anymore. Now we can intervene to restore peace and order in Cuba. Cuba could not sign a treaty with a foreign power that limited its independence. This was also part of the Platt Amendment. So now you're limiting Cuba as to what they can do in terms of who they deal with other nations or how they deal with other nations. They were limited. And it said the U.S. could maintain a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. By the way, there's still a naval base right now at Guantanamo Bay. So you see the impact of the Platt Amendment from 1901 all the way to, in this case, 2020. So the U.S. did have a whole bunch to say in Cuba. Puerto Rico, the Forker Act of 1900 basically said that Puerto Rico was granted limited degree of popular government, withheld full self-rule. Congress granted U.S. citizenship in 1917 to Puerto Rico. The status of places such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines were uncertain, and many questions came up. One of the questions was, did the rights and protections under the U.S. Constitution follow the U.S. flag? Apparently, the court said that the constitutional rights are not automatically extended to people in American territorial possession. So some people agree with this decision, other people don't. They feel that it was very unfair. The Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo was the leader of the Filipino movement for independence against Spain. And, when the United States came basically to liberate the Philippines, basically Emilio Aguinaldo fought alongside the U.S. because he thought that the U.S. was going to give him freedom right after the Spanish-American War. Now, following the Treaty of Paris, he thought that the Philippines would receive independence, but that was not the case. And brutal guerrilla war takes place between the U.S. and the Philippines. And that this is a sad story because you have Emilio Aguinaldo fighting against the Spaniards or Spain alongside the United States, thinking that the Philippines were going to be free and liberated, but it was not the case because as soon as Spain was defeated, the United States actually fully controlled the Philippines. And here you have a political cartoon of American social Darwinism, in which you see Uncle Sam here basically carrying, primitive people, carrying indigenous people, carrying African Americans, basically all the way to the top of the mountains, which is like the peak of civilization, this high sort of like civilizations. And it's a good way basically to portray how the United States saw other nations. Now, which nation is England? Hauling up the hill. What about the U.S.? Well, you're going to see like the top man right there basically represents England, and like the bottom, the man following him is the United States. Here you see basically, the Philippines, they're being washed and, cleaned. They're being civilized by this man here. It's a sad representation of how Americans view the rest of the world. Access to China. The United States was very interested in gaining access to markets all over the world, but in this case, it's access to China. The problem was that other nations had carved up China in its spheres of influence, and its spheres of influence refers to an area exclusive trading privileges. Secretary of State John Hay announces what became known as the Open Door Policy in 1899, which basically said that all nations should have equal trading privileges in China. China, in this case, did not want any foreign nations from basically dominating their nation, and we had what became known as the Boxer Rebellion, which was an attempt to remove foreign influences in China. But it did not work, and ultimately the rebellion was put down by an international force, and China basically became dominated by foreign nations. William McKinley is re-elected in the election of 1900s. Theodore Roosevelt becomes president when McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Under Roosevelt, there will be a dramatic rise in the power of the presidency. TR will pursue an expansionist foreign policy, and his saying was, speak softly and carry a big stick. And here you have this political cartoon which shows basically TR with his big stick, and you see a whole bunch of people right by his legs, meaning that he was all powerful, meaning that he controlled many areas, and he could punish people with the big stick, or the new diplomacy. This political cartoon, it illustrates a reality of how the United States was beginning to see the world around the 1900s. The Panama Canal. The presence of a canal would dramatically cut down travel time. This would benefit trade, and it would benefit the military. If you see to the right, you see that traveling from San Francisco through the Pacific Ocean all the way to the tip of South America is 13,000 miles. And then you will have to travel back up again through the coastal area, so South America all the way to New York. So that was a long time to travel. The Panama Canal facilitated a shorter path to moving from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And basically the distance is 5,200 miles versus 13,000 miles. So it was beneficial for the United States to build the Panama Canal. First attempt to build the canal was actually by France, but they failed. Roosevelt attempted to get Colombia to allow the United States to build a canal in Panama. Remember, Panama was controlled actually by Colombia. Colombia rejects the treaty that would have allowed the U.S. to build the canal. TR decides to secretly support the movement for Panamanian independence from Colombia, and he was actually able to do so. And obviously Panama became independent, and the U.S. actually got the right to build the Panama Canal once Panama gained its independence from Colombia. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine in 1823 basically said or told European nations to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Various Latin American countries owe money to countries such as England and Germany. England sent warships to Venezuela, for example, in 1902. Santo Domingo also owed money. And the U.S. was worried that Europe would continue to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt responds by issuing the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically said the U.S. has the right to intervene in Latin America. U.S. dramatically expanded its role in Latin America by the Roosevelt Corollary. Various presidents sent troops to Haiti, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and even Nicaragua so many times in order to get those nations to cooperate with the United States. All of this movement basically strained relations between the U.S. and Latin America. Roosevelt in East Asia. TR wins Nobel Prize for helping negotiate a peace agreement ending the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So Roosevelt was very active, in what was happening around the world. Japan basically beats down Russia. The U.S. increasingly was concerned over the growing strength of Japan. And the Gentlemen's Club Agreement of 1908, this is basically concerning laws in California that discriminated against Asian immigrants. And, San Francisco required Asian students to attend segregated schools. San Francisco was basically putting Asian people on a whole different platform versus, like white people. They would go to separate schools. Now, TR and Japan were able to reach a compromise. Japan secretly agreed to restrict the immigration of Japanese workers to the U.S., and that TR would pressure California to repeal its law. Now, the Great White Fleet, TR wanted to demonstrate to the world that the United States basically had power. And between 1907 and 1908, Roosevelt sent basically a new fleet of U.S. battleships on a trip around the world. In this case, he sent a whole bunch of these military forces around the world in order to demonstrate the growing power of the United States. Now, do not forget to subscribe. This has been a lesson on U.S. imperialism. If you are studying for a U.S. history test, if you are studying for your AP U.S. history test, please watch this video a couple of times as it will help you be successful.